The Denver courthouse stood like a monument to justice itself, its marble columns stretching toward a gray Colorado sky that threatened snow. Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy oak doors with her mother, Lisa, her small hand wrapped so tightly around her stuffed rabbit that the seams were beginning to fray. The rabbit, a faded pink creation named Mr. Hoppy, had been Sarah's constant companion for the past 6 months, ever since the day her world imploded. She was only 3 years old, and already she carried the weight of trauma that would crush most adults. 6 months ago, on a Tuesday afternoon in April, Sarah's older brother Michael had disappeared. He was 7 years old in the 2nd grade, supposed to be walking home from school like he did every day. Instead, he'd simply vanished. The first hours were frantic. Lisa called the school, then the police, then friends, then family, her voice becoming increasingly hysterical with each call. By evening, an Amber Alert had been issued across Colorado. By the next morning, search helicopters were combing the Rocky Mountains. By the end of the first week, police suspected kidnapping. By the end of the first month, the case had gone national, featured on every news network and true crime podcast. What made this case even more unbearable was that Sarah had been with Michael. The two had been playing in their front yard when the man in the dark sedan pulled up. Sarah, only 3, didn't understand what was happening. She remembered the man's voice, harsh and commanding, telling Michael to get in the car. She remembered Michael's expression changing from curiosity to fear. She remembered the car door opening and her brother being pulled inside. And then, inexplicably, the man had grabbed her too. For 37 days, both children were missing. 37 days during which Lisa barely slept, barely ate, and spent every waking moment answering police questions, sitting through interviews with detectives, and staring at her children's photographs on missing persons flyers. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when an anonymous tip led police to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Denver. But it wasn't just the tip that led them there. It was Max. Detective James Rodriguez's German Shepherd partner had tracked a scent across 3 miles of difficult terrain, through alleys and parks and residential neighborhoods, never losing focus, never getting distracted. When they finally arrived at the warehouse, Max had barked twice, his signal, and officers had rushed in to find Michael and Sarah in a locked room, frightened and traumatized, but alive. The relief that flooded Lisa when she saw her children again was so overwhelming that she collapsed to the ground, sobbing. But relief quickly transformed into something more complicated. Sarah had survived the ordeal physically, but emotionally and psychologically she was shattered. The kidnapper, Derek Summers, had kept the children in darkness most of the time. He'd used fear as a weapon, making threats, telling Michael that if he tried to escape, Sarah would be hurt. He'd fed them irregularly, kept them in cold conditions, and subjected them to psychological torment. Michael, older and more resilient, had begun processing his experience with a child psychologist. But Sarah, tiny 3-year-old Sarah, struggled to understand what had happened. She had nightmares. She suffered from separation anxiety so severe that Lisa couldn't leave the room without Sarah screaming. She had regressed developmentally, no longer able to use the bathroom independently. Her speech had become fragmented, filled with pauses and hesitations. Now, as Lisa guided her daughter through the courthouse doors, Sarah's small frame seemed even tinier against the grand architecture surrounding her. The courthouse was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors that they were entering a place of serious consequence and grave judgment. Sarah didn't understand any of that. She just knew that the bad man was here somewhere, and she was terrified. The hallway leading to the courtroom was bustling with activity. Journalists crowded near the entrance, their cameras clicking and whirring. Legal professionals in dark suits moved purposefully between chambers. Court officers stood at strategic positions, maintaining order. Lisa had to navigate through this chaos while holding Sarah's hand and carrying a small bag of comfort items, coloring books, stuffed animals, juice boxes, anything that might help calm her daughter if things became too overwhelming. As they approached the courtroom itself, Lisa felt her heart rate accelerating. She had been through this process before, coaching Sarah on what to expect. "You'll sit in a special chair," she'd told her daughter. "There will be some people asking you questions. Mommy will be nearby, and you'll tell them about the bad man, okay? You'll be so brave." Sarah had nodded solemnly, but Lisa could see the fear in her eyes, the way her small body trembled at the mention of the bad man. Inside the courtroom, everything was precisely arranged for this moment. Judge Margaret Warren, a woman in her 60s with decades of experience and a reputation for wisdom, had personally overseen the preparations. She understood that Sarah's testimony was crucial to the case, but she also understood that Sarah was a traumatized child. The judge had made accommodations that were highly unusual but absolutely necessary. A small chair, specially built for a 3-year-old, sat near the witness stand. Soft lighting had been installed to reduce the severity of the usual courtroom illumination. Sarah's mother would be allowed to sit where her daughter could see her. There would be water and tissues nearby. The court would take breaks whenever Sarah needed them. At the defense table sat Derek Summers, the man who had stolen 6 weeks from Sarah's life and left permanent scars on her psyche. He was in his mid-40s, with a weathered face and cold eyes that seemed to calculate everything around him. He was confident, arrogant even. His attorney had already told him not to worry. A 3-year-old's testimony was unreliable, easily challenged, potentially inadmissible depending on how things proceeded. In his mind, no jury would convict based on the word of someone barely out of toddlerhood. He had no idea what was about to unfold. And in the back corner of the courtroom, sitting with perfect posture and alert intelligence, was Max. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, fully trained, and had already become a local hero for his role in finding Michael and Sarah. His dark coat was immaculate, his ears stood at attention, and his dark eyes surveyed the room with the calm confidence of someone, or rather, a dog, who understood his purpose. Max had experienced countless courtrooms before, countless trials where his presence served to comfort and sometimes intimidate. But this time felt different. This time, something extraordinary was about to happen. Detective James Rodriguez stood beside Max, one hand resting gently on the dog's collar. He had worked with Max for 4 years, had trained with him, had depended on him countless times, and had seen this remarkable animal do things that seemed almost supernatural in their accuracy and perception. Rodriguez was nervous, though he tried not to show it. He believed in Sarah's testimony. He believed in the truth of what she had experienced. But he also understood how fragile children could be, how easily they could be broken by the intensity of a courtroom environment. As Lisa took her seat with Sarah beside her, as the bailiff called for order, as Judge Warren prepared to begin proceedings, no one, not Lisa, not the judge, not the prosecutor, not the defense attorney, not the jury members filing in, and certainly not Detective Rodriguez, had any idea that they were about to witness something that would become legendary in legal and psychological circles. In just a few hours, a 3-year-old girl would demonstrate a level of courage, clarity, and connection that would change the trajectory of justice itself. The courtroom was a theater of tension where every detail mattered. Rows of wooden benches, polished to a deep mahogany shine, stretched back from the front of the room where justice would supposedly be served. Journalists occupied the first few rows, their presence a constant reminder that this wasn't just a trial. It was a spectacle that had captured the nation's attention. News cameras had been banned from the courtroom itself, but that hadn't stopped the media frenzy. Outside, reporters had set up camp on the courthouse steps, waiting to catch any detail, any tidbit they could spin into their evening broadcasts. Behind the journalists sat curious onlookers, people drawn by the sensational nature of the case, the human interest angle, the unfolding drama of a child witness. Some were genuine supporters of justice. Others were simply voyeurs seeking entertainment through tragedy. A few were other victims and their families, understanding intimately what the Mitchell family was enduring. There was an elderly woman in the third row who had lost her own child to violence decades ago. She had come to bear witness, to support the idea that children could speak truth to power, that their voices mattered. The gallery was full by 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the proceedings were scheduled to begin. Security officers checked everyone who entered, ensuring no weapons or recording devices made their way inside. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. People whispered to each other, craning their necks to see the defendant, the judge, the witnesses who would testify. Derek Summers sat at the defense table with his attorney, Martin Blackwell, a man known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to find reasonable doubt in the most damning circumstances. Summers wore a dark suit, his appearance carefully curated to present respectability. His hair was neatly combed, his tie was conservative, his face was arranged in an expression of calm concern, the image of an innocent man wrongly accused. But those who looked closely could see the calculation in his eyes, the slight curl of his lip when he thought no one was watching, the way his fingers tapped against the table with a rhythm of impatience or perhaps confidence. Summers had been arrested 3 weeks after Michael and Sarah were found. DNA evidence from the warehouse, witness testimonies from neighbors who had seen a suspicious sedan in the area, and most damning of all, fibers from Sarah's clothing found in the vehicle had connected him directly to the crime. But Summers wasn't concerned about these details. He'd studied the system, understood its vulnerabilities, and believed he could exploit them. His attorney had already outlined the strategy: create doubt about Sarah's reliability as a witness, suggest that she was confused or coached, imply that trauma could distort memory, propose alternative explanations for the evidence. A 3-year-old child, Martin Blackwell had told his client confidently during their preparation sessions, cannot reliably testify. The jury will understand that. Children this young confuse reality with imagination, fantasy with fact. They're suggestible. They can be coached without even realizing it. If the mother or the police planted memories, Sarah would believe them as truth. We'll be gentle with her, sympathetic even, but we'll demonstrate that her testimony is essentially worthless. Summers had nodded, satisfied with this analysis. He was arrogant enough to believe that the system would protect him, that the age of his accuser was actually his greatest defense. He had no idea what he was about to face. The prosecutor, Ms. Victoria Harmon, sat at the opposite table, her demeanor focused and intense. She was in her early 50s, with steel-gray hair and a reputation for meticulous case preparation. She had 30 years of experience, had prosecuted over 200 cases, and had an impressive conviction rate. She was brilliant, methodical, and uncompromising in her pursuit of justice. But even with all her experience, she was nervous about this case. Not because she doubted the evidence was solid, but because her primary witness was a 3-year-old girl. Harmon had spent countless hours preparing Sarah and Lisa for what was about to happen. She'd visited their home, worked with Sarah in a calm environment, establishing rapport and trust. She'd coached Lisa on how to support her daughter without being seen as coaching. She'd consulted with child psychologists about the best way to question a trauma victim of Sarah's age. She'd walked through the courtroom with Sarah beforehand, showing her the witness chair, explaining what would happen, trying to demystify the process and make it less intimidating. But no amount of preparation could guarantee success. Harmon knew that juries were unpredictable. They had biases, preconceptions, vulnerabilities to manipulation. Even if she presented perfect evidence and perfect testimony, there was always a chance that jurors would doubt a 3-year-old. That was the gamble. That was the uncertainty that kept her awake at night. Judge Margaret Warren sat in her chambers until 9:50 a.m., reviewing her notes one final time. She was 63 years old, had been a judge for 22 years, and had presided over hundreds of trials. But this one felt different. This one would require not just legal expertise, but also wisdom, compassion, and an understanding of the unique vulnerabilities of child witnesses. She had personally crafted the accommodations for Sarah, the specially built chair, the adjusted lighting, the provisions for breaks. She had also issued strict instructions that everyone in the courtroom was to treat Sarah with respect and gentleness, that aggressive cross-examination would not be tolerated, that if Sarah became too distressed, proceedings would be halted. At exactly 10:00 a.m., Judge Warren entered the courtroom and everyone stood. The bailiff called for order, announcing the case. The State of Colorado versus Derek Summers, docket number 2024 CV043287. The formality of it all was designed to convey the gravity of justice, the seriousness of the legal system. But to Sarah, who waited in a small side room with her mother, it was simply terrifying. Lisa held her daughter's hand and looked into her eyes. Sarah was wearing the dress they'd chosen together, a soft pink with small white flowers, something that made her feel a little more confident. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her other arm. Lisa had gone over the instructions dozens of times. You'll sit in the special chair. Some people will ask you questions. You tell them the truth, okay? Just like we practiced. Mommy will be right over there where you can see me. You'll be so brave. Sarah's eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. She didn't fully understand what was happening or why it mattered. She only knew that the bad man was in the next room, that she was going to have to talk about things that scared her, and that her mother was counting on her to be brave. At 10:05 a.m., a court officer opened the side door. "We're ready for Miss Sarah Mitchell," he said softly. Lisa squeezed her daughter's hand one final time. "You've got this, sweetie. You're so brave." As they walked toward the courtroom, neither of them could have known that in just a few hours, Sarah would demonstrate a level of courage and clarity that would astonish everyone present. Neither of them could have known about the moment of connection that awaited. Neither of them could have known that this small girl, barely tall enough to reach the witness chair, would become the turning point in a case that would be discussed in law schools and psychology departments for decades to come. As the courtroom door opened before them, the noise of the packed gallery quieted slightly. All eyes turned toward the little girl walking in, and the true waiting game, the waiting for justice itself, was about to begin. Sarah sat in the small wooden chair, her feet dangling several inches above the floor. The chair had been specially built for her, painted a soft blue with little clouds carved into the back. To the adults in the courtroom, it was a thoughtful accommodation. To Sarah, it was a strange throne in an alien world. She gripped her stuffed rabbit so tightly that if Mr. Hoppy could feel pain, he would have been screaming. The rabbit's button eyes stared straight ahead, and Sarah kept her gaze fixed on those familiar eyes, afraid to look anywhere else. Judge Warren had conducted the oath ceremony with surprising gentleness. She'd bent down slightly, not enough to be patronizing, but enough to be at eye level with Sarah, and explained what telling the truth meant. "When you promise to tell the truth, that means you tell us real things that really happened. Do you understand?" Sarah had nodded, barely perceptibly. The judge had proceeded with the abbreviated oath, and now Sarah was officially a witness in a court of law. Ms. Harmon stood and approached the witness chair with a warm, reassuring smile. She'd spent weeks building rapport with Sarah, and she knew that the first few questions were crucial. They needed to establish that Sarah could communicate, that she understood the concept of truth, that she could follow instructions. They also needed to calm Sarah's obvious anxiety. "Hi, Sarah, do you remember me?" Harmon asked softly. Sarah nodded. "What's my name?" Sarah's voice came out barely above a whisper. "MS, Ms. Harmon." "That's right, you're doing great. I just want to ask you some easy questions first, okay? Just like we practiced." For the next 10 minutes, Harmon asked innocuous questions. What was Sarah's favorite color? Blue, Sarah answered. What was her favorite animal? Dogs. The answers came slowly, hesitantly, but they came. Jurors began to relax slightly. A few smiled at Sarah's responses. She was articulate enough despite her age. She could answer questions. Then Harmon began to transition into the more serious territory. "Sarah, do you remember when Michael went away?" The question was asked gently, but it was like flipping a switch. Sarah's entire body stiffened. Her grip on the rabbit became, impossibly, even tighter. "Yes," she whispered. Can you tell me about that day? What do you remember? Sarah's eyes darted around the courtroom. They landed on Lisa, who nodded encouragement. Sarah's lips moved, but no words came out at first. Then very quietly she began to speak. A man came. In a car, he was loud. What did the man look like, Sarah? This was when things began to deteriorate. Sarah's breathing became shallow. She described the man's appearance: dark hair, rough face, mean eyes. Her descriptions were accurate and specific, but with each detail she provided, she seemed to retreat further into herself. Her voice became smaller. Her leg began bouncing beneath the chair. She started swallowing repeatedly, a sign of acute anxiety. Harmon recognized the distress but also understood she needed to establish more details while Sarah was still able to communicate. What did the man say to you and Michael, Sarah? Sarah's hands trembled. The rabbit slipped slightly from her grip and she clutched it again desperately. He said Michael had to come, he said. He said if we didn't come, bad things would happen. In the gallery, Lisa's eyes filled with tears. The elderly woman who had lost her own child reached over and squeezed Lisa's arm. Judge Warren watched carefully, assessing whether to intervene. Not yet, she decided. Sarah was still answering, still functioning. But the defendant's attorney, Martin Blackwell, was waiting for his opportunity. He sat at the defense table with a slight smile, confident that the child's obvious distress would actually work in his favor. Juries might sympathize with a traumatized child, but they would also question the reliability of that child's testimony. Trauma affected memory. Fear distorted facts. This little girl, terrified and confused, would inadvertently help his case. When Harmon finally sat down, Judge Warren gave Sarah a break. "Would you like some water, Sarah?" Sarah nodded, and a court officer brought her a small cup with a lid and straw. Sarah sipped at it with shaking hands. The break lasted 5 minutes, but it wasn't enough. When Blackwell stood and approached the witness chair, Sarah's entire body went rigid with dread. Blackwell had been instructed to be gentle, and he obeyed the letter of that instruction while violating its spirit. His questions were posed in a soft voice, but they were designed to undermine and confuse. "Sarah, is it possible you're remembering things that didn't actually happen? Sometimes when we're scared, our memories get a little mixed up. Could that be what happened to you?" Sarah didn't understand the question fully, but she understood that this man was doubting her. Her eyes filled with tears. "No, it really happened." "But you were very scared, weren't you? And when we're scared, sometimes we imagine things, right?" "No, I didn't imagine it." Sarah's voice cracked and the tears began to flow. Not just tears, sobs. Her small body was racked with the kind of crying that comes from a place of primal fear and trauma. Lisa lunged toward her, but Judge Warren gently held up a hand. The judge wanted Sarah to compose herself, to demonstrate that she could continue. But what Sarah needed was her mother. What Sarah needed was safety. Blackwell continued with his questions, his tone still measured and soft, still technically complying with the rules about not being aggressive. "Did anyone tell you what to say today, Sarah? Did your mom talk to you about what you should say?" "She said tell the truth," Sarah cried, her voice now openly panicked. "But did she tell you what the truth was? Did she describe the man to you?" Sarah was hyperventilating now, her small chest heaving with the effort of breathing between sobs. Her coherence was deteriorating rapidly. Her answers became fragmented. "No, I don't. He was mean. I remember." Judge Warren finally intervened. "Mr. Blackwell, we're taking a break." It wasn't a question. The judge looked at Lisa. "You may comfort your daughter." Lisa rushed to the witness stand and scooped Sarah into her arms. Sarah wrapped herself around her mother like a lifeline, crying so hard that her entire body shook. The courtroom fell silent. The jury watched with visible discomfort. Even Blackwell looked somewhat chastened, though not enough to change his strategy. For the next 15 minutes, Sarah was inconsolable. She was having something that looked very much like a panic attack. She couldn't catch her breath. She kept repeating, I'm sorry, over and over, apologizing for being afraid, for crying, for falling apart. Lisa rocked her, whispering reassurances, but Sarah was beyond reassurance. She had been forced to relive the trauma, then attacked by someone who didn't believe her, and the result was a complete psychological shutdown. Judge Warren consulted with both attorneys. Harmon wanted to continue, believing that once Sarah calmed down, she could resume her testimony. Blackwell suggested that the child was too disturbed to be reliable, that continuing would be cruel and pointless. The judge made a decision to take a longer break, nearly 40 minutes, and have Sarah see the courthouse psychologist for some emergency support. As Lisa carried her traumatized daughter out of the courtroom, the case seemed to be crumbling. Everyone in that room was wondering the same thing. Could a 3-year-old ever be expected to handle the pressure of testifying against her kidnapper? Was the entire case going to collapse because Sarah simply couldn't endure the psychological ordeal? The prosecutor looked defeated. The defendant looked relieved. And no one, not a single person in that courtroom, had any idea that something extraordinary was about to change everything. The courthouse psychologist, Dr. Patricia Chen, had done her best during the break. She'd worked with Sarah in a quiet side room, using calming techniques, breathing exercises, and gentle reassurance. But Sarah remained fragile, her small body still trembling with residual panic. The court-ordered psychologist had recommended that perhaps Sarah had been traumatized enough for one day, that forcing her to continue might cause irreversible psychological damage. Judge Warren had assured everyone that they would resume proceedings, but she'd also made clear that if Sarah couldn't handle it, the trial would be rescheduled. This case was important, but not more important than a child's well-being. After 35 minutes, Sarah and Lisa returned to the courtroom. Sarah's face was blotchy from crying, her eyes swollen and red. She looked absolutely devastated, completely wrung out emotionally. As she climbed back into the small chair, she looked smaller than before, as if the trauma had physically diminished her. She held Mr. Hoppy in a death grip, and her eyes were fixed downward, staring at her lap. Judge Warren began the testimony again with extreme gentleness. Sarah, I know that was hard. We're going to continue, but if you need to stop, you just say the word, okay? Can you tell me if you need a break? Sarah nodded mutely, still not looking up. Harmon approached the stand again, her strategy now completely altered. She would ask the minimum necessary questions. She would speak in the softest possible tones. She would not push. The goal now was simply to get Sarah through this, to salvage whatever testimony remained possible. She began with what Sarah had already stated, simple confirmations that wouldn't require deep recollection or emotional processing. Sarah, you remember when the man came, right? Sarah nodded. Can you point to him, the man who came? This was crucial. Sarah's ability to identify Derek Summers in the courtroom was essential for the prosecution. Sarah's eyes slowly lifted from her lap. They moved, reluctantly, toward the defense table. She looked directly at Derek Summers for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough to identify him, short enough that she didn't have to endure his gaze. Then her eyes darted away. That's him, she whispered. The jury took this in. Even in her traumatized state, Sarah could identify her kidnapper. That was significant. But Blackwell rose again for cross-examination, and Sarah immediately began to shut down. Her breathing became shallow. Her legs started bouncing. She was retreating inward, preparing herself for another assault of doubt and confusion. She couldn't handle this. Everyone in the courtroom could see it. Even Blackwell seemed to recognize that continuing would be pointless. He began his questioning, but his voice was softer now, almost gentle, as if he, too, was affected by the sight of this destroyed child. Sarah, after the man took you and Michael, do you remember what happened next? Sarah's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She tried again. Still nothing. Her eyes were becoming glassy, unfocused. She was entering a state of psychological dissociation, where trauma was becoming too much to process and her mind was attempting to escape by disconnecting from reality. The courtroom was deathly silent. Reporters in the back scribbled notes about the tragedy unfolding before them. The gallery watched with a mixture of sympathy and morbid fascination. Judge Warren leaned forward, concerned. Lisa's hands gripped the bench so hard her knuckles turned white. And in the back corner of the courtroom, Detective James Rodriguez felt his heart breaking for this tiny girl. That's when it happened. Sarah's eyes, which had been unfocused and distant, suddenly shifted. They moved away from Blackwell, away from the judge, away from the hostile energy of the courtroom. They drifted backward, past the gallery, past the journalists, past all the adults with their agendas and their questions, and they landed on Max. The German Shepherd was still sitting in perfect position beside Detective Rodriguez, his posture impeccable, his attention alert. But as Sarah's eyes found his, something shifted in the dog's demeanor. Max's ears, which had been in a neutral position, tilted slightly forward. His dark eyes, which had been scanning the room with professional awareness, suddenly focused entirely on Sarah. It was as if every other person, every other stimulus, every other concern in that courtroom had simply ceased to exist for this dog. For a moment, perhaps only 2 or 3 seconds, the entire world contracted to just these two beings, a traumatized 3-year-old girl and a 6-year-old German Shepherd police dog. Detective Rodriguez felt it immediately. He'd worked with Max for 4 years and had never seen the dog react to anything with this intensity. It was as if Max recognized something in Sarah, understood something about her pain that transcended species and experience. Sarah's breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow. Her leg, which had been bouncing anxiously, stilled. The tension in her small shoulders seemed to ease slightly. She wasn't moving, wasn't reaching out, wasn't doing anything dramatic. She was simply looking at Max, and Max was simply looking at her. But in that exchange of gazes, something profound was occurring. Everyone in the courtroom noticed. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Blackwell trailed off mid-question, confused by the change he sensed but didn't understand. Judge Warren's eyebrows rose slightly. Harmon looked up from her notes, wondering what had just happened. The jury members exchanged glances, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Max took a single breath, a deep, centering breath, and his tail gave one slow, deliberate wag. Not excited, not playful, but calm and purposeful. It was the kind of movement that seemed to communicate. I see you. I understand. You're not alone. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on Max's. She wasn't looking away. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She was simply present in this moment with this dog who had, 6 months ago, tracked through miles of difficult terrain to find her. Max had smelled her fear in that warehouse. Max had led the rescuers to where she and Michael were imprisoned. Max understood, in a way that perhaps only an animal could understand, that this girl was the child he had saved. And Sarah, in some primal way that exists beyond words and logic, seemed to recognize that this was the dog who had cared enough to find her. Judge Warren, who had been about to intervene with the cross-examination, paused. She wanted to see what would happen next. She'd presided over hundreds of trials, and she'd never seen anything like this. There was no precedent for what she was witnessing. This wasn't in any legal handbook. This wasn't in any courtroom protocol manual. Blackwell, uncertain how to proceed with a witness who was no longer even looking at him, sat down. He looked to his client for guidance, but Derek Summers was staring at Sarah and Max with a dawning realization that something had shifted in the courtroom dynamic, something he didn't control and didn't understand. Lisa, watching her daughter, saw the change in Sarah's breathing, the relaxation of her shoulders, the slight easing of her facial expression. Her heart leapt with hope. Whatever was happening, it was helping. Her baby was being comforted by this dog, this remarkable animal that had saved her son. Detective Rodriguez kept his hand on Max's collar, but he didn't pull away. He was witnessing something sacred, something that transcended the normal rules of a courtroom. This was healing. This was the dog's purpose manifesting in real time, not to track or to arrest, but to comfort and to remind a traumatized child that good things still existed in the world. The moment stretched on for perhaps 10 seconds, an eternity in courtroom time. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in this extraordinary connection between a girl and a dog, between trauma and grace, between despair and hope. The silence in the courtroom was absolute and suffocating. Every person present understood, on some level they couldn't quite articulate, that they were witnessing a moment of profound significance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the courthouse, a phone rang in a distant office. But inside this room, there was only silence and stillness, and the invisible thread connecting a traumatized child to a gentle dog. Sarah's small body had shifted into a state of calm that seemed almost miraculous given her state of panic moments before. Her breathing had synchronized with Max's, in and out, steady and centered. Her eyes remained locked on his dark gaze, and Max maintained his absolute focus on her, as if this moment required every ounce of his being, every particle of his consciousness. Judge Warren sat motionless at the bench, her judicial authority temporarily suspended in the face of something that transcended law and order. In her 22 years as a judge, she had never encountered anything like this. She understood that interfering would be wrong, that this moment needed to continue unfolding naturally, that whatever was about to happen required space and silence. Lisa watched her daughter with tears streaming down her face. She could see the transformation occurring in Sarah's body, the way her shoulders had dropped from their tense position near her ears, the way her fingers had loosened their death grip on Mr. Hoppy just slightly. Her baby was being healed by this dog in real time, and Lisa was witnessing something that would change how she understood the world forever. Detective Rodriguez's hand remained on Max's collar, though he'd relaxed his grip. He was a trained law enforcement officer, professional and by the book, but in this moment, he was simply a man watching his partner do something extraordinary. Rodriguez had dedicated his career to understanding animals, to training them, to working with them in service of justice. But this moment transcended training. This was pure, instinctive connection. This was a dog recognizing a child who needed help and providing it with absolute certainty. In the gallery, reporters had stopped scribbling notes. Even the most cynical of them understood that something was occurring that couldn't be captured in words, that wouldn't be properly conveyed in a news broadcast. This was a human moment, a moment of grace and healing, and it existed outside their usual framework of coverage. Derek Summers sat at the defense table with growing unease. He could feel the courtroom's emotional shift. He could see the jury members with tears in their eyes. He could sense that whatever advantage he'd gained through Sarah's breakdown was evaporating. Whatever strategy he'd employed was suddenly irrelevant. Something more powerful than cross-examination, more compelling than reasonable doubt, was unfolding before the jury's eyes. Martin Blackwell, the defense attorney, leaned over to whisper something to his client, but Summers waved him away with irritation. Blackwell sat back, recognizing that his expertise was useless in this moment. This wasn't about law. This wasn't about procedure. This was about something fundamental to human experience, the healing power of connection, the redemptive capacity of compassion, the way a child's trust in goodness could be restored through the simple presence of something kind and gentle. And then slowly, Sarah began to move. It started with her right arm. She lifted it from her lap with deliberate slowness, as if every muscle had to be carefully commanded to obey. Her small fingers extended outward, away from her body, away from the safety of her mother's vicinity. She was reaching, but not forward, toward the judge or the prosecutor or anyone in the immediate courtroom. She was reaching backward, toward the back corner where Max sat. Sarah's arm rose higher, her elbow straightening, her small hand opening like a flower unfurling to the sun. And then her index finger extended, a gesture so simple yet so profound in its clarity. She was pointing, not asking, not hesitating, not uncertain, pointing with the absolute certainty of a child who knows exactly what she knows. She was pointing at Max. The entire courtroom seemed to collectively gasp. Some gasps were audible. Some were silent, internal reactions to the significance of the gesture. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about in legal circles, psychology departments, and families gathered around dinner tables for years to come. And then Sarah spoke. Her voice was different now, not the whispered, frightened voice of moments before, not the panicked, fragmented voice of her testimony. This voice was clear, strong, certain. It came from a place of absolute clarity, of truth recognized and acknowledged. Good dog. 2 words, just 2 words, 4 syllables total. A statement so simple that a child could make it, yet so profound that it reverberated through the courtroom like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was so complete that it felt physical. People stopped breathing. Journalists dropped their pens. Jurors froze mid-gesture. Judge Warren's mouth opened slightly in astonishment. The court reporter's hands remained suspended above the keyboard, the words captured but the moment transcending the mechanical act of recording. Lisa gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears poured down her face. These weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of recognition, of hope, of understanding that her daughter had found her voice. In one moment, with 2 words, Sarah had demonstrated something that no amount of careful questioning or gentle preparation could have achieved. She had shown clarity of mind, strength of spirit, and the ability to distinguish between good and evil. Detective Rodriguez felt his throat constrict with emotion. He understood what Sarah was saying. She was identifying Max not just as a dog, but as a beacon of goodness in her traumatic experience. She was saying that she remembered being saved. She was saying that she understood the difference between the man who hurt her and this animal who helped her. She was saying that goodness still existed in her world. Max's tail gave a single, slow wag, not exuberant or playful but gentle and affirming, as if the dog was acknowledging Sarah's words, accepting her recognition, and offering his continued presence and protection. Derek Summers' face had gone pale. He leaned over to Martin Blackwell and whispered urgently, but Blackwell was staring straight ahead, understanding that they had just lost the case. Not because of evidence or expert testimony or prosecutorial skill, but because a 3-year-old girl had pointed at a dog and said 2 words that conveyed absolute truth. The jury members were openly weeping now. Several had their hands over their mouths. One older gentleman in the back row was shaking with sobs. They weren't crying because of sentimentality. They were crying because they had just witnessed a child reclaim her power, find her voice, and speak truth with an authority that transcended her age and trauma. Judge Warren took a long breath and gathered herself. She looked at Sarah with an expression of profound respect and something that might have been awe. This child, barely tall enough to reach the witness chair, had just accomplished something extraordinary. She had testified, not through detailed answers to careful questions, but through the simple act of pointing and nomming goodness. "Sarah," Judge Warren said softly, "you did very well today, very well indeed." Sarah was looking at Max again, her arm still extended, her finger still pointing. And in that moment, as the courtroom slowly returned to normal, reporters reaching for their phones, attorneys exchanging whispered conversations, the machinery of justice beginning to process what had just occurred, everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. The 2 words "good dog" had become the most powerful testimony ever given in that courtroom. Not because of legal cleverness or prosecutorial skill, but because they represented the truth spoken with absolute clarity by a child who had endured the unendurable and emerged with her conscience intact, her capacity for love unbroken, and her ability to recognize goodness still alive and thriving within her heart. The courtroom seemed to exhale collectively as Judge Warren called for a brief recess. Everyone needed a moment to process what had just occurred, to absorb the emotional magnitude of Sarah's 2 words and understand how they would reshape the entire trajectory of the trial. The judges' chambers filled with whispered conversations. The prosecution team huddled together, energized by the shift in momentum. The defense team sat in stunned silence, acutely aware that their case had been fundamentally compromised by a moment of pure, uncalculated human truth. During the break, Ms. Harmon approached Sarah and Lisa with cautious optimism. She understood the psychological dynamics that had just unfolded. "Sarah," she said softly, "you did something really brave just now. Do you want to take a little break, or are you ready to answer some more questions?" She half expected Sarah to need extensive time to recover, to require coaxing and reassurance. But something had shifted in Sarah as well. The connection with Max had done more than provide momentary comfort. It had fundamentally realigned her internal emotional state. The panic that had threatened to consume her had been replaced by something else, a sense of being understood, of being protected, of being held safely in another being's awareness. Sarah had experienced genuine compassion, and it had reminded her that she was not alone in the world. "I can answer more questions," Sarah said quietly, her voice still small but no longer trembling with terror. When the proceedings resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally changed. The jury's posture had shifted. They were leaning forward now, engaged and attentive in a way they hadn't been before. The judge's expression had softened. She was now clearly invested in supporting Sarah's testimony rather than simply managing the child witness logistics. Even the journalists in the gallery had stopped their frantic note-taking, understanding that they were in the presence of something that transcended the usual courtroom drama. Ms. Harmon began again, but this time her approach was different. She wasn't trying to extract details through careful, leading questions. Instead, she was simply asking Sarah to tell her story, to share what she remembered, to describe her experience. And something extraordinary happened. Sarah's testimony, which had been fragmented and panicked before the recess, became coherent and detailed. "What happened after the man put you and Michael in the car?" Harmon asked gently. Sarah's eyes, which had been focused back toward Max several times during the break, seemed to draw strength from the dog's continued presence. "He drove for a long time. Michael was scared. The man told him to be quiet or bad things would happen to me. Michael didn't say anything after that. He was trying to protect me." The courtroom was completely silent. This detail, Michael's protective instinct, his willingness to sacrifice his own emotional needs to shield his younger sister, added profound emotional weight to the testimony. The jury members were no longer just hearing facts. They were understanding the psychological and emotional reality of what these children had endured. "What happened when you got to where you were kept?" Harmon continued. Sarah described the warehouse with remarkable clarity. The brick walls, the high windows that let in thin shafts of light, the metal door that locked from the outside, the small room where she and Michael were confined. She described the darkness, the cold, the fear. She described how Michael had tried to make games out of their captivity to keep her calm, a detail that suggested both his desperate love for his sister and his own psychological coping mechanisms. But the most powerful moment came when Harmon asked about Derek Summers specifically. "Can you describe what the man looked like, Sarah?" Sarah's description was specific and accurate. She noted his dark hair, his rough voice, the way his eyes looked when he was angry. She described a large scar on his left arm that she remembered because he'd tried to hide it. She described a distinctive birthmark on his shoulder, a detail that Sarah had mentioned before, but which now took on profound significance because it was something only someone present during the kidnapping could possibly know. Most importantly, she described his behavior, the way he'd threatened them, the specific phrases he used, the pattern of when he would appear and disappear. She described how Michael had tried to memorize these patterns, trying to understand the kidnapper's routine so they could somehow anticipate what would happen next. And she described how afraid she'd been that Michael would do something that would make the bad man hurt her. As Sarah spoke, Detective Rodriguez realized that she was providing a psychological profile of Derek Summers' behavior that would be invaluable to the prosecution. She wasn't just identifying him. She was describing his patterns, his habits, his verbal tics. She was painting a portrait of someone dangerous and disturbed. Whenever Sarah hesitated or seemed to be struggling emotionally, her eyes would drift to Max, and the dog would return her gaze with absolute presence and calm. It was as if Max was serving as an emotional anchor, reminding her that she was safe, that someone was listening, that her words mattered and were being heard and believed. The cross-examination that followed was transformed as well. Martin Blackwell, recognizing that Sarah's testimony had become devastatingly credible, adjusted his strategy. He couldn't attack her anymore. The jury would never forgive him for doing so after witnessing the two-word moment. Instead, he attempted to suggest alternative explanations, to imply that memories could be confused, to propose that perhaps some details were unclear. But Sarah's responses were consistent and unwavering. "I remember that because," she would say, and then provide specific details that made her memories indelible and credible. She wasn't defensive or argumentative. She was simply stating facts with the certainty of someone who had lived through something so terrifying that every detail had been seared into her memory. "Are you absolutely sure about that?" Blackwell asked, his tone attempting to introduce doubt. "Yes," Sarah said firmly. "I remember because Michael looked at me when he said it. I remember his face." The jury took this in. A 3-year-old girl who could remember the specific expressions on her brother's face during trauma was a 3-year-old girl whose testimony was absolutely credible. As the testimony continued, the prosecution's case was being systematically reconstructed and strengthened. Sarah's breakdown had actually served to make her more, not less, credible. She wasn't a child who had been coached or whose testimony had been shaped by careful questioning. She was a child who had been traumatized, who had found her way through that trauma to clarity and truth, and who was now speaking with the authority of lived experience. By the time her testimony concluded, not a single juror doubted her. Several were openly wiping away tears. One woman in the jury box was holding Sarah's gaze with an expression of fierce protectiveness, as if she would personally ensure that this child received justice. Judge Warren looked at Sarah with visible respect. "You were very brave today, Sarah. Thank you for telling us the truth." As Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she walked directly to where Max was sitting and, without asking permission, put her small hand on the dog's head. Max remained perfectly still, accepting her touch with the grace of a being who understood that this gesture meant something profound. The defendant's case had not just been damaged, it had been destroyed, not by legal maneuvering or expert testimony, but by the simple truth spoken by a child who had found her voice and her courage through connection with something kind and good. The jury had heard the facts, but more importantly, they had witnessed the heart of justice itself, a child's determination to speak truth, and the world's commitment to believing and protecting her. The jury deliberation room was silent except for the sound of a coffee maker percolating in the corner and the occasional shuffle of papers. 12 ordinary citizens sat around a large wooden table, tasked with determining whether Derek Summers was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of kidnapping, child endangerment, and unlawful imprisonment. But what they were really grappling with was whether they believed a 3-year-old girl who had pointed at a dog and said 2 words that had shaken the foundations of the courtroom itself. The foreperson, a retired mathematics teacher named Harold Chen, had been selected by his peers. He was analytical, methodical, and fair-minded, precisely the kind of person you wanted leading a jury through complex legal questions. But this case, he quickly realized, wasn't particularly complex. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimony was credible. The defendant's defense had been thoroughly dismantled. "I think we can start with the kidnapping charge," Harold suggested. "Do we all agree that the evidence supports guilt beyond a reasonable doubt?" The response was immediate and overwhelming. 11 hands went up. Only one juror, a woman in her 70s named Margaret, hesitated. "Margaret," Harold asked gently, "do you have concerns?" Margaret shook her head slowly, tears in her eyes. No, I was thinking about that little girl, about what she endured, about how brave she was. I'm sorry, I'm ready to vote guilty." She raised her hand, making it unanimous. The same pattern repeated itself for the other charges. Guilty on child endangerment. Guilty on unlawful imprisonment. By the time they came to the question of whether Derek Summers posed a danger to the community, relevant to the sentencing phase, the vote was again unanimous. No member of the jury had any doubt that this man was dangerous and should face the maximum penalty. The entire deliberation process took 6 hours, but 3 of those hours were spent discussing sentencing recommendations and processing the emotional weight of what they'd witnessed. The actual determination of guilt had taken perhaps 20 minutes. Everyone in that jury room knew that the turning point hadn't been the physical evidence or the expert testimony. It had been a moment when a terrified child had found courage through connection with a dog and spoken 2 words that contained all the truth that mattered. At 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon, the jury returned to the courtroom. Derek Summers sat at the defense table with his attorney, his face a mask of false confidence that was beginning to crack at the edges. He'd seen the jury's faces as they entered. He'd seen the tears, the grim determination, the way they refused to make eye contact with him. He knew, on some level, that his case was lost, but he wasn't prepared for the finality of the verdict. The judge asked the standard questions. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreperson responded. The bailiff took the verdict form from Harold's hands and passed it to Judge Warren. The judge read it silently, her expression remaining neutral in the way that judges' expressions always remain neutral, regardless of the verdict. Then she handed the form back to the bailiff to read aloud. On the charge of kidnapping in the first degree, how does the jury find? Guilty, the foreperson said clearly. Derek Summers' face went pale. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, but Summers seemed not to feel it. On the charge of child endangerment in the first degree, how does the jury find? Guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment in the first degree, how does the jury find? Guilty. As each verdict was read, Derek Summers seemed to physically shrink. His shoulders hunched forward. His face, which had been artificially composed, collapsed into something between rage and despair. He looked toward his attorney with an expression of confusion, as if he couldn't understand how his carefully constructed defense had crumbled so completely. The courtroom erupted in a complex mixture of reactions. Some spectators applauded quietly, a sound quickly suppressed by the bailiff's stern look. Others wept openly. Lisa, sitting in the front row with Michael and Sarah, made a sound that was part sob and part gasp of relief. She pulled both her children close, holding them as if she would never let them go again. Judge Warren called for order and then addressed the court with gravity and purpose. This jury has spoken clearly and decisively. Before we move to the sentencing phase, I want to make several observations that I believe are important for the record. Everyone in the courtroom fell silent, understanding that the judge was about to make a statement that would become part of the official record and potentially be cited in future legal proceedings. I have presided over this courtroom for 22 years, Judge Warren began. I have heard thousands of hours of testimony from witnesses of all ages and backgrounds, but I have never witnessed anything quite like what occurred in this courtroom during the testimony of Sarah Mitchell. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. This child, barely 3 years old, who had endured unspeakable trauma, demonstrated a level of clarity, honesty, and courage that puts many adult witnesses to shame. When confronted with a situation designed to confuse and intimidate her, she found her voice not through force of will or legal preparation, but through connection with an animal that had literally saved her life. The judge's gaze moved toward Max, who sat calmly in the back of the courtroom with Detective Rodriguez. The defendant's counsel attempted to suggest that a young child's testimony is inherently unreliable, but this jury, through their verdict, has confirmed what many of us witnessed, that Sarah Mitchell's testimony was not just reliable, it was the most compelling and credible testimony presented in this case. Her words, simple, direct, and utterly truthful, deserve to be remembered as an example of the power of human honesty in the pursuit of justice. Judge Warren then addressed sentencing. "Derek Summers, please stand." Summers rose slowly, his body language defeated and broken. "You have been found guilty of kidnapping in the first degree, child endangerment in the first degree, and unlawful imprisonment in the first degree. These are among the most serious crimes our legal system recognizes. You stole the childhood of 2 innocent children. You inflicted psychological trauma that will require years of healing. You demonstrated a complete absence of conscience or remorse." The judge paused, shuffling through her sentencing notes. "It is the judgment of this court that you are hereby sentenced to 15 years imprisonment on the kidnapping charge, 10 years on the child endangerment charge, and 8 years on the unlawful imprisonment charge, to be served consecutively. You will be eligible for parole review in no fewer than 30 years. You are remanded into the custody of the Colorado Department of Corrections, effective immediately." As bailiffs moved to take Derek Summers into custody, he made one final attempt to maintain his composure. But as he was led away, he couldn't help but glance back at the Mitchell family, at Michael and Sarah sitting close to their mother, at their faces reflecting relief and the first glimmer of peace they'd experienced in months. Outside the courthouse, the media was waiting in full force. Lisa emerged with both children, neither of whom understood the full significance of what had just occurred, but both of whom sensed that something had shifted, that they were safer now, that the bad man couldn't hurt them anymore. A reporter thrust a microphone toward Lisa. "Ms. Mitchell, how do you feel about the verdict?" Lisa looked down at her children, then back at the courthouse, then at Detective Rodriguez and Max emerging from the building. "I feel," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision, "like my family has been given a second chance, like my daughter was heard, like justice was served not because of lawyers or evidence or procedure, but because a 3-year-old girl found the courage to tell the truth." She paused, then added, "And I think that courage came from knowing she wasn't alone, that there were people and animals who believed in her and wanted to protect her." As cameras clicked and journalists called out questions, Sarah reached down and petted Max, who had come to stand beside her. The dog's tail wagged gently, a simple acknowledgement of their connection. The story would make national news. The image of Sarah touching Max's head would become iconic, appearing on news broadcasts and in newspapers across the country. But more importantly, justice had been served. A predator had been removed from society. 2 children had been given the opportunity to begin their healing journey. And the world had witnessed something extraordinary. The power of truth spoken by the smallest, most vulnerable voice, amplified not by legal systems or adult protection, but by the simple compassion of a good dog. 1 year had passed since that extraordinary day in the Denver courtroom. 12 months during which Sarah Mitchell had undergone a transformation that seemed almost miraculous to those who had witnessed her breakdown and her triumph. The 3-year-old girl who had sat trembling in a witness chair, terrified and traumatized, had become a thriving 4-year-old who ran through parks with abandon, laughed with genuine joy, and showed almost no visible signs of the horror she had endured. The healing hadn't been instantaneous or effortless. The first months after the trial had been challenging. Sarah still had nightmares occasionally. She still experienced moments of anxiety when she was in unfamiliar situations. She still sometimes became clingy when Lisa had to leave the room, a remnant of her separation anxiety. But the difference was profound. Sarah was no longer controlled by her trauma. She was moving through her fear rather than being trapped within it. Much of her recovery could be attributed to the work she'd done with Dr. Patricia Chen, the child psychologist who had become Sarah's guide through the healing process. Dr. Chen had recommended something that seemed almost too simple to be effective, that the Mitchell family get a dog of their own. Not as a replacement for Max, Dr. Chen had carefully explained, but as part of Sarah's ongoing recovery. A dog of her own would give her agency and control. She could build a relationship based on trust and safety, and she could be the protector rather than always being the protected. 2 months after the trial ended, the Mitchell family adopted a golden retriever puppy from a local rescue organization. They named her Sunny, and the moment Sarah first saw the golden puppy, something shifted in her eyes. This was her dog, not the police dog who had found her, but her own companion whom she could love and care for. The responsibility of caring for Sunny gave Sarah a sense of purpose and agency that was deeply healing. She learned to feed Sunny, to walk her, to play with her, and in doing so, she learned that she was capable, that she was strong, and that she could build relationships based on love and trust. Michael, now 8 years old, had also made remarkable progress. He'd been working with his own therapist, processing the guilt he carried for not being able to protect Sarah better, for being afraid, for being helpless. His therapist had helped him understand that he was a child who had acted with extraordinary courage and love toward his sister, that his protective instinct was something to be proud of, not something to feel ashamed about. Michael had returned to school and was excelling academically. He joined the school soccer team and had even made a few close friends who knew nothing about his past. He was, in many ways, reclaiming the normal childhood that had been stolen from him. Lisa had also undergone her own journey of healing. The months following the kidnapping and the trial had been some of the most difficult of her life. She'd carried fear, guilt, and a bone-deep worry that her children would never recover. She'd questioned herself constantly. Could she have protected them better? Could she have prevented this? Should she have done something different? But gradually, working with her own therapist and watching her children heal, she came to understand that she had done everything right. She had gotten them help immediately. She had supported them through trauma. She had fought for justice. And she was rebuilding a life filled with hope and possibility. The Mitchell family had also become advocates for victims' rights and trauma recovery services. They donated substantial funds to the Denver Police Department's K-9 unit in Max's name. The Sarah's Hope Fund for K-9 services had been established to provide specialized training for police dogs to work with trauma victims, to provide therapy dog services in courtrooms and hospitals, and to recognize the extraordinary role that animals could play in human healing. Detective James Rodriguez had made a significant decision about his career. After 20 years as an active police officer, he decided to retire from traditional law enforcement and shift his focus entirely to therapy dog work. He and Max had become certified therapy animal handlers, and they now worked with trauma victims, veterans with PTSD, children in hospitals, and individuals struggling with grief and loss. Max had become something of a local celebrity, the police dog whose presence in a courtroom had changed a trial's trajectory, and whose gentle nature had helped countless people find their way back to wholeness. One afternoon, 6 months into her recovery, Sarah had asked her mother if she could see Max again. "I want to tell him thank you," she'd said simply. Lisa had arranged a meeting with Detective Rodriguez at the park where he often took Max for training and relaxation. When Sarah saw Max walking toward her, she didn't hesitate. She ran to the dog and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his golden fur. Max stood perfectly still, as if understanding the profundity of the moment, then gently placed his chin on her shoulder. For several minutes they stayed like that, a 4-year-old girl and a 7-year-old dog, communicating without words what words could never fully capture. Lisa watched from a distance, tears streaming down her face, understanding that her daughter had just completed another crucial step in her healing journey. She had acknowledged the dog who had saved her. She had offered her gratitude. She had closed a circle. On Sarah's 4th birthday, the Mitchell family held a special celebration. There was cake and presents and family gathered around the table. But the most special moment came when Detective Rodriguez and Max arrived as surprise guests. Sarah's face lit up with pure joy, and she spent the evening with Max beside her, sometimes petting him, sometimes just sitting close to him, sometimes talking to him about her life and her dog Sunny and her brother Michael and her mother. As the evening progressed and the sun began to set over the Colorado mountains, Sarah sat with Max's head resting on her lap. She looked at her mother with an expression of peace and contentment that Lisa had feared she might never see again. "Mommy," Sarah said quietly, "Max is still a good dog." Lisa smiled through her tears and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, he absolutely is." The media had continued to follow the story, but in a different way. Instead of focusing on the crime or the trial, they had shifted their attention to the healing and recovery narrative. Magazine articles had been written about Sarah's resilience and about the role that Max had played in her healing. Psychology journals had published papers analyzing the phenomenon of human-animal connection in trauma recovery. Law schools had begun using the Sarah Mitchell case as a teaching tool for understanding how unconventional evidence and testimony could be powerful in courtrooms. The moment when a 3-year-old girl had pointed at a dog and said, "Good dog," had become legendary. But for the Mitchell family, what mattered most wasn't the media attention or the recognition. What mattered was that they had survived something devastating and emerged stronger, more connected, and more grateful for the simple goodness that existed in the world. Sarah had learned that there were good people and good animals who would protect her. Michael had learned that his love and courage mattered. Lisa had learned that her family could survive almost anything if they stayed together and asked for help. And they had all learned that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, one that moved forward in small steps and big leaps, sometimes progressing and sometimes requiring rest, but always ultimately moving toward hope. A year and a half after the trial, Sarah started kindergarten. She was happy, confident, and curious. She made friends easily. She had adapted to a new school with minimal anxiety. When asked by her teacher to draw a picture of someone who made her feel safe, Sarah drew a dog, not specifically Max, but the idea of Max, the archetype of goodness and protection that the dog had represented. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Max the police dog had become more than just a news story. It had become a symbol of resilience, of the healing power of connection, of the capacity of even the smallest voice to speak truth with overwhelming clarity. And it had begun a conversation about trauma recovery, about victim support, and about the extraordinary ways that animals could help humans heal. Most importantly, it had given Sarah, Michael, and Lisa their lives back, not unchanged by what had happened, but transformed by grace, love, and the steady presence of those who believed in them and stood beside them on their journey toward wholeness.